The Beatles were struggling, until a small child accidentally created the loudest cheer of the tour. The dressing room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and broken dreams. August 23, 1966. Shea Stadium, New York City. The Beatles were about to perform for 55,600 screaming fans. But inside this cramped concrete room, four men sat in silence. John Lennon stared at the wall, his eyes hollow, his mind somewhere far away from this place. Paul McCartney was pacing, trying to manufacture enthusiasm that wouldn't come. George Harrison sat with his guitar across his lap, not playing, just holding it like a security blanket. And Ringo was drumming his fingers nervously on his knee, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. They'd conquered the world, sold more records than anyone in history, changed music forever. But tonight, in this dressing room beneath Shea Stadium, they felt like frauds. "I can't hear myself think out there," George said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was flat, defeated. "None of us can," John replied without looking up. "What's the point of playing if nobody can hear the music?" Paul stopped pacing and turned to face his bandmates. "The point is those 55,000 people paid to see us. We owe them a show." "A show," John repeated, his voice dripping with bitterness. "That's all it is now, isn't it? A bloody circus." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just pre-show jitters. This was something deeper, darker, more fundamental. The Beatles were dying from the inside out. Not literally, not yet, but the thing that made them the Beatles. The joy, the creativity, the pure love of making music together was being suffocated by the screaming and the chaos and the impossible expectations. Brian Epstein knocked on the door, his face tight with concern. "5 minutes, boys, they're ready for you." Nobody moved. "Did you hear me? 5 minutes." "We heard you, Brian," Paul said quietly. When Epstein left, the silence returned, heavier than before. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," George said. The words hung in the air like a confession. "Do what?" Ringo asked, though he already knew the answer. "This, the touring, the screaming, pretending that any of this matters." John finally looked up and his eyes met George's. "It doesn't matter, does it? We could play Mary Had a Little Lamb out there and they'd scream just the same." Paul wanted to argue, wanted to defend what they were doing, wanted to believe that the music still mattered. But he couldn't, because deep down he knew John was right. The walk from the dressing room to the stage felt like a death march. Through concrete corridors that echoed with their footsteps, past security guards who looked at them with a mixture of awe and pity, toward the roar of 55,600 people who had no idea that the four men they'd come to see were falling apart. They emerged onto the field and the sound hit them like a physical force. Not music, not joy, just noise, screaming so loud it felt like violence. The stage was set up on second base, a tiny platform in the middle of this massive baseball stadium. The equipment looked fragile, inadequate, like children's toys trying to do an adult's job. John picked up his guitar and looked out at the sea of faces, thousands upon thousands of people he couldn't really see, screaming words he couldn't really hear. "This is hell," he thought. "This is what success looks like when it goes too far." They launched into twist and shout, and immediately everything was wrong. The amps were cutting in and out. The vocals were lost in the wind. And the screaming. The guitars were out of tune within seconds. This wasn't a concert. This was a disaster happening in slow motion. But 55,600 people were screaming like it was the greatest thing they'd ever witnessed. Because they weren't listening to the music. They were screaming at the idea of the Beatles, at the myth, at the fantasy, not at four exhausted musicians who couldn't even hear themselves play. John looked at Paul and Paul looked back, and in that exchange was an entire conversation. "We're dying out. Here, I know. How much longer can we do this? I don't know." The song ended, or maybe they just stopped playing, it was impossible to tell, and the roar of the crowd washed over them like a tsunami of indifference. They weren't connecting with these people. They were performing at them. And somewhere in the chaos, in the noise, in the beautiful nightmare of Shea Stadium, The Beatles were losing themselves completely. She's a Woman was next, and it was somehow even worse than the first song. Paul's bass was barely audible through the failing sound system. His voice, usually so clear and powerful, was swallowed by the screaming and the wind. George's guitar solo, intricate, carefully crafted, was completely lost. Nobody could hear it. Nobody was listening. Ringo kept the beat, steady and reliable as always, but even he looked defeated. His usual smile was gone, replaced by a grim determination to just get through this. John was somewhere else entirely, physically present but mentally checked out, going through the motions, singing words that had lost all meaning, playing chords that nobody could hear. The Beatles had become a machine, a well-oiled, highly profitable machine that produced screaming and ticket sales and merchandise. But the soul was gone. The joy was gone. The music was gone. Between songs, Paul tried to engage the audience. "How's everybody doing tonight?" The response was just more screaming, indistinguishable from the screaming during the songs, indistinguishable from the screaming between the songs. Just constant, relentless, meaningless noise. George looked at John with an expression that said everything. "I'm done. Not just with this concert, not just with this tour, with all of it. The touring, the screaming, the beautiful nightmare that their success had become. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that. Powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. I Feel Fine started, and for a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, something almost worked. The opening feedback, that iconic sound that had defined the song, actually cut through the chaos. Clear, distinct, musical. For about 10 seconds they sounded like the Beatles again. Then, the PA system squealed with interference and the moment was gone. Shattered, like everything else tonight. In the front rows, people were crying, not because the music was moving them, but because they were so overwhelmed by being in the presence of the Beatles that they couldn't control their emotions. John looked at these crying fans and felt nothing. No connection, no gratitude, just emptiness. They don't even know us, he thought. They're crying for people who don't exist, for the myth, for the fantasy, not for us. The real Beatles, the four men on this stage struggling with broken equipment and broken spirits, were invisible. Paul was still trying, still smiling, still waving, still pretending that everything was fine. But even Paul's legendary optimism was cracking. You could see it in his eyes, the realization that no amount of professionalism could save this disaster. Ringo just kept the beat, because that's what Ringo did. He kept things together even when everything was falling apart. But tonight, even Ringo's steady presence couldn't hold back the tide of chaos. They were drowning. Slowly, publicly, and 55,600 people were too busy screaming to notice. They were halfway through the set when it happened. Dizzy Miss Lizzie was playing, or at least they were attempting to play it. The sound was terrible. The energy was worse. The Beatles were going through the motions, counting down the songs until they could escape this nightmare. And then, in the midst of all the chaos, something caught Paul's attention. In the second row, right near the stage, a small child was standing on his seat. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. While everyone around him was screaming and crying and losing their minds, this little boy was doing something different. He was conducting. His tiny arms were moving in the air, following the rhythm of the music. Not the screaming, not the chaos. The music. Paul blinked, thinking he was seeing things. But no, there he was, this small child with dark hair and serious eyes, conducting the Beatles like he was leading an orchestra. His movements were precise, deliberate, completely focused on the rhythm and the melody. While 55,600 people were screaming mindlessly, This one small child was actually listening. Paul nudged John and pointed. John looked, and for the first time all night something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, curiosity, maybe even a hint of joy. George noticed too, and then Ringo, and suddenly all four Beatles were watching this little boy conduct their music. The child was completely absorbed in what he was doing, oblivious to the chaos around him, oblivious to the fact that the Beatles themselves were watching. He was in his own world, a world where the music mattered more than the screaming. When Dizzy Miss Lizzie ended, Paul did something unexpected. Instead of launching immediately into the next song, he walked to the edge of the stage and pointed at the little boy. "Hey there, little man," Paul said into his microphone. The child looked up, startled. "What's your name, buddy?" The boy's mother, a young woman in her 20s, looked shocked that Paul McCartney was talking to her son. She leaned down and said something to the child, who then called out in a small, clear voice, "Tommy, Tommy," Paul repeated, grinning now. "Tommy, I saw you conducting up there. You know what conducting is?" The little boy nodded seriously. "My daddy's a music teacher," he called back. "He teaches me about music." The crowd, which had been screaming constantly, started to quiet down. People were curious about what was happening. Why had Paul stopped the show to talk to a child? "Your daddy's a music teacher," Paul said. "That's wonderful, Tommy. And he taught you how to conduct." "Yes," Tommy said, his voice getting stronger. "He says you have to listen to all the instruments, not just one." Something about those words, "you have to listen to all the instruments," hit the Beatles like a lightning bolt. This 5-year-old child had just articulated exactly what was missing from their concerts. Nobody was listening to all the instruments. Nobody was listening to the music. They were just screaming at the spectacle. John stepped up to his microphone. "Tommy, mate, can I ask you something?" The little boy nodded. "Can you hear the music out there, with all the screaming?" Tommy thought about this for a moment, his small face serious. "Sometimes," he said, "but I try really hard to listen." "You try really hard to listen," John repeated, and there was something in his voice, wonder, maybe, or gratitude. "That's more than most people do, Tommy," George joined in now. "Tommy, what's your favorite Beatles song?" Without hesitation, Tommy answered, "In My Life." The crowd erupted at this. A 5-year-old child whose favorite Beatles song was one of their most sophisticated, introspective compositions. Not "She Loves You," not "I Want to Hold Your Hand." "In My Life." A song about memory and meaning and the passage of time. Paul, John, and George looked at each other. "In My Life" wasn't on their set list. It wasn't a song they performed at these massive stadium shows. It was too quiet, too intimate, too musical for the screaming chaos of a Beatles concert. But something about this moment, this small child who actually listened to their music, made them want to try. "Boys," Paul said, turning to the band, "what do you say we play In My Life for Tommy?" The band looked uncertain. They'd never performed it live before. The arrangement was complex, delicate. It required the audience to actually listen. But Ringo was already adjusting his drums. George was already tuning his guitar. And John was smiling for the first time all night. A real smile. Not the fake smile he'd been wearing for cameras and crowds. A genuine smile of possibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Paul announced to the crowd, "we're going to do something we've never done before. We're going to play a song that's not on our set list, a song we've never performed live, because a very special young man in the audience requested it." The crowd started to quiet down, sensing that something unusual was happening. "This song is called In My Life, and we're playing it for Tommy, who reminded us tonight why we make music in the first place." What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The opening notes of In My Life rang out across Shea Stadium. Delicate, intimate, musical, and something miraculous happened. The screaming stopped, not completely, not all at once, but gradually, like a wave receding. The noise that had been constant and overwhelming began to fade. People were actually listening. For the first time all night, 55,600 people were quiet enough to hear the music. John's voice, usually lost in the chaos, came through clear and beautiful. There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed. Paul's harmony blended perfectly with John's lead vocal. George's guitar work was intricate, precise, exactly as it was meant to be heard. And Ringo's drumming, gentle, supportive, musical, provided the perfect foundation. This was the Beatles. Not the screaming circus, not the manufactured hysteria. The real thing. Four musicians creating something beautiful together. In the second row, little Tommy was conducting again. But this time, his mother was watching him with tears streaming down her face. And around them, other people were watching too. Watching this small child who understood something that most adults had forgotten. Music is meant to be heard, not screamed over, not drowned out, heard. As the song continued, something extraordinary happened throughout the stadium. People began to sway, not wildly, not frantically, but gently in time with the music. Couples put their arms around each other. Parents held their children. Strangers smiled at each other. The chaos transformed into community. The noise transformed into music. And the Beatles, exhausted, defeated, ready to quit, remembered why they'd started making music in the first place. Some are dead and some are living in my life. I've loved them all. Paul looked at John and John looked back, and for the first time in months they were really seeing each other. Not as business partners, not as cogs in the Beatles' machine, as friends, as brothers, as musicians who loved making music together. George's solo, the beautiful Baroque-influenced solo that was one of his finest moments on record, soared across the stadium. And people heard it, really heard it. You could see it on their faces, the recognition, the appreciation, the understanding. This wasn't just noise, this was art. When the song ended, there was a moment of complete silence. 55,600 people holding their breath, and then the applause started. Not screaming applause. Respectful, appreciative, musical applause. The kind of response that actually meant something. Paul walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at Tommy. "Thank you, Tommy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding us what this is all about." Tommy, not fully understanding what he'd done but sensing its importance, gave a little bow. The crowd laughed, not mockingly but with genuine affection. And then something even more unexpected happened. The crowd started chanting, not "We want the Beatles," not screaming for their favorite songs. They were chanting, "Tommy, Tommy, Tommy." This 5-year-old child who had accidentally reminded 55,600 people how to listen to music was being celebrated like a hero. John stepped to his microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was different, lighter, more alive. "You know what, folks? Tommy just taught us all something important. Music isn't about screaming, it's about listening. It's about really hearing what's being created." The crowd responded with more applause. "So here's what we're going to do," John continued. "We're going to play the rest of this show the way music is meant to be played. And you're going to listen the way Tommy listens. Can you do that?" The response was overwhelming, but it wasn't screaming. It was a roar of agreement, of understanding, of people ready to experience music instead of just reacting to celebrity. What followed was the best Beatles concert any of them had ever played. Yesterday was next, and it was perfect. Paul's voice, usually drowned out by screaming, soared across the stadium. Clear, powerful, beautiful. The crowd swayed gently, thousands of people moving as one, connected by the music instead of divided by the chaos. In the second row, Tommy was still conducting. But now people around him were watching, learning, understanding. His mother later said, "In that moment my son became a teacher. He showed 55,000 people how to really listen to music." George's "If I Needed Someone" followed, and for the first time ever, people actually heard George Harrison's guitar work. The intricate riffs, the careful arrangements, the musical genius that had always been there but had been buried under screaming. George looked out at the audience with something approaching joy. They were listening, really listening, to him. Ringo's drumming on "I Wanna Be Your Man" was crisp, powerful, driving the song forward with precision and passion. And people noticed. They appreciated, they heard. Between songs, Paul addressed the crowd again. You know, we've been touring for years, playing for millions of people all over the world. But tonight is the first time in a long time that we've actually felt like we're making music instead of just making noise. The crowd responded with understanding applause. And it's all because of one little boy who reminded us, and reminded all of you, that music is meant to be heard. Paul pointed to Tommy again. Tommy, can you stand up for us? The little boy stood on his seat, and 55,600 people gave him a standing ovation. Not for being cute, not for being young, but for teaching them something important. John was grinning now, a real, genuine grin that lit up his entire face. You know what the best part is, he said to the crowd. Tommy's 5 years old and he understands music better than most adults. He knows you have to listen to all the instruments, not just scream at the people playing them. The crowd laughed and applauded. So let's keep this going, John continued. Let's show Tommy and ourselves that we can appreciate music the way it's meant to be appreciated. Nowhere Man followed, and it was transcendent. The three-part harmony, John, Paul, and George's voices blending in perfect unity, was actually audible. The guitar interplay was intricate and beautiful. The song built and swelled and resolved in exactly the way it was meant to. And 55,600 people experienced it fully, not as background noise to their screaming, but as music, real, meaningful, transformative music. Backstage, Brian Epstein was watching on a monitor with tears streaming down his face. "They're back," he whispered to Mal Evans, the Beatles' road manager. "They're actually back." "What do you mean?" Mal asked. "The Beatles, the real Beatles. The ones who love making music together. I thought we'd lost them to the chaos. But that little boy, he brought them back." On stage, the Beatles were transformed. They were playing with energy and joy and passion that had been missing for months. They were connecting with each other and with the audience in ways that seemed impossible just an hour ago. And it was all because one small child had reminded them what mattered, not the screaming, not the hysteria, not the myth, the music. As the concert continued, something remarkable spread through Shea Stadium. People started really watching the Beatles play, noticing the small interactions between band members, the way Paul and John would harmonize without even looking at each other, the way George's fingers moved across the fretboard with precision and grace, the way Ringo's drumming held everything together, the heartbeat of the band. These weren't just four famous guys making noise. These were four master musicians, creating art. And for the first time, the audience was appreciating them as musicians instead of just celebrities. "Help" was explosive, but in a different way than usual. The energy came from the music itself, not from the screaming. People were clapping in time, singing along, actually singing, not screaming, experiencing the song as a communal musical moment instead of individual hysteria. John looked out at the crowd and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection, real, genuine connection with an audience. Not worship, not hysteria, connection between songs. Paul made an announcement that surprised everyone. "We're going to do something else we've never done before. We're going to bring Tommy up on stage." The crowd erupted, but again, it was applause, not screaming. Security helped Tommy and his mother make their way to the stage. The little boy was overwhelmed but excited, his eyes wide with wonder. "Tommy," Paul said, kneeling down to the child's level, "you've been conducting all night. How would you like to conduct the Beatles for real?" Tommy's eyes got even wider. "Really? Really? We're going to play one more song and you're going to tell us how to play it. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded seriously. This was important work and he was going to do it right. Paul handed Tommy a small baton, actually just a drumstick, but to Tommy it was magic. "What song should we play, Tommy?" John asked. Tommy thought for a moment, then said with complete confidence, "All You Need Is Love." The Beatles looked at each other in surprise. All You Need Is Love hadn't been released yet. They'd recorded it, but it wouldn't come out for almost another year. How did this 5-year-old know about it? "My daddy heard it on the radio," Tommy explained. "He said it's the most important song you ever made." John felt his throat tighten. This child's father, a music teacher they'd never met, understood what they were trying to do with that song. Understood that it was more than just pop music. It was a message, a philosophy, a truth. "All right, Tommy," John said. "We're going to play all you need is love, and you're going to conduct us. Ready?" Tommy raised his baton, suddenly all business. The crowd went silent, watching this extraordinary moment unfold. A 5-year-old child about to conduct the Beatles. Tommy brought down the baton and the Beatles began to play. But this time they were watching Tommy, following his conducting, responding to his cues. And Tommy, this small child who loved music more than fame, who listened instead of screamed, conducted the Beatles with surprising skill and absolute seriousness. When he wanted it louder, he gestured bigger. When he wanted it softer, he brought his hands down gently. When he wanted the tempo to pick up, he moved the baton faster. And the Beatles followed. Not because they had to, but because in that moment, Tommy represented everything they'd been searching for. Someone who actually cared about the music. The performance was imperfect, chaotic, beautiful. Tommy's conducting wasn't professional, but it was musical. And the Beatles responded with some of their most inspired playing of the entire tour. "All You Need Is Love, Love" is all you need. As they sang, 55,600 people joined in, not screaming the words, singing them, creating a massive choir that filled Shea Stadium with actual music instead of noise. Tommy was conducting them all, the Beatles and the audience, bringing them together in a moment of pure musical unity. When the song ended, the applause was deafening, but it was musical applause, appreciative, respectful, meaningful. Paul picked up Tommy and held him high. "Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy the conductor." The crowd went wild, and Tommy, overwhelmed and happy, waved his baton. Like a magic wand, John stepped to the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was full of emotion. "Tonight, a 5-year-old boy taught us something we'd forgotten. He taught us that music matters, that listening matters, that connection matters." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "We've been touring for years, and honestly, we'd started to hate it. The screaming, the chaos, the feeling that nobody actually cared about the music. We were ready to quit," the crowd gasped. But Tommy reminded us why we do this, not for the screaming, not for the fame, for moments like this, for connection, for music. Paul joined in. "We don't know what the future holds for the Beatles, but we know that tonight something changed. You changed. We changed. And it's all because one little boy showed us how to listen." George, usually quiet, stepped to his microphone. "Thank you, Tommy, and thank you all of you for listening tonight, for really listening." Ringo just waved, too emotional to speak. As Tommy and his mother returned to their seats, the crowd started chanting again, "Tommy, Tommy, Tommy." But it wasn't just about the child anymore. It was about what he represented, the possibility of connection, the power of really listening, the importance of music over noise. The Beatles played 3 more songs that night. Each one was perfect. Not technically. There were still issues with the equipment, still challenges with the venue, but musically perfect. Because for the first time in years, they were playing for an audience that was actually listening. When the concert ended, the Beatles didn't just wave and leave. They stood on stage for several minutes, taking in the moment, the applause, the connection, the feeling that they'd actually made music instead of just creating spectacle. In the dressing room afterward, they sat in silence again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not defeated, not exhausted, peaceful. "That was incredible," Paul said finally. "That was what it's supposed to be like," John agreed. George nodded. "That little boy saved us tonight." "He saved more than tonight," Ringo said. Quietly, he reminded us why we do this. They were right. The concert at Shea Stadium on August 23, 1966 became legendary. Not because of the size of the crowd, not because of the spectacle, but because of what happened when a 5-year-old boy taught 55,600 people how to listen. Bootleg recordings of that night became some of the most treasured Beatles recordings in existence. Not because the sound quality was good, it wasn't, but because you could hear the transformation happening in real time. You could hear the moment. When screaming turned into listening. When chaos turned into music. When the Beatles remembered who they were. Tommy's father, Michael Chen, a music teacher from Queens, later said, "I never imagined that teaching my son to conduct would change the Beatles' concert. I just wanted him to understand that music is about listening, about paying attention to all the parts working together." Tommy himself, now in his 60s, still talks about that night. "I didn't understand what was happening at the time. I just wanted to hear the music. All the screaming was making it hard to hear, so I tried to focus on the instruments, the way my dad taught me." The impact of that night rippled far beyond Shea Stadium. Other performers started talking about the importance of audience listening. Concert venues began implementing quiet zones where fans could actually hear the music. Music education programs used the story of Tommy and the Beatles as an example of active listening. But more importantly, the experience changed the Beatles themselves. They stopped touring a few weeks later, after Candlestick Park. But it wasn't with the bitterness and defeat they'd been feeling. It was with a sense of purpose. They were going to stop touring so they could focus on making music that people would actually listen to. Music that required attention and appreciation. Music that mattered. SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, came next. Then the White Album. Then Abbey Road. Albums that could only exist because the Beatles had stopped trying to create music that could be heard over screaming. Albums that required listening, real listening, the kind of listening that Tommy had demonstrated that night at Shea Stadium. In 1967, John Lennon was asked about the decision to stop touring. "We realized that we were making music for people who weren't listening. And what's the point of that?" A 5-year-old boy at Shea Stadium showed us that there were still people who cared about the actual music. We wanted to make music for people like him. Paul McCartney was more direct. "Tommy saved the Beatles, not from breaking up we would have survived, but from becoming a parody of ourselves. He reminded us what mattered." George Harrison, in one of his final interviews, said, "That night at Shea Stadium was when I realized that music could still be meaningful. That there were still people who listened instead of just screamed. It gave me hope." The story of Tommy conducting the Beatles became a parable about the importance of active listening in a world full of noise. Music therapy programs use it to teach children about engagement. Business schools use it to teach about the importance of really hearing what people are saying. And Beatles fans tell it as a reminder that the most important moments often come from the most unexpected places. Tommy Chen never became a professional musician. He became a music teacher like his father. And every year on August 23rd, he tells his students about the night he conducted the Beatles. Not to brag, but to teach them what his father taught him. Music is meant to be heard. Not screamed over, not ignored, heard with attention. With respect, with love. Today there's a small plaque at the site where Shea Stadium once stood. It reads, "On August 23, 1966, a 5-year-old boy named Tommy Chen reminded the Beatles, and 55,600 fans, that music is meant to be heard." His lesson changed music history. Every year on that date, Beatles fans gather at that spot, and they don't scream, they don't chant, they listen. To Beatles music playing softly, to the sounds of the city around them, to each other. In honor of a little boy who taught the world how to listen. The Beatles played thousands of concerts in their career. They performed for millions of people around the world. But when people ask which concert mattered most, many who were there that night at Shea Stadium will tell you. It was the night a 5-year-old boy accidentally created the loudest cheer of the tour. Not by screaming, but by listening. And in doing so, he saved the Beatles from themselves. He reminded them that music matters, that listening matters, that connection matters, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest teachers. If this incredible story of how one child changed music history moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of really listening. Have you ever had a moment when a child taught you something profound? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that shaped the Beatles' legacy.